Hello Marvel fans, my name's Francis and welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to talk about my most anticipated game for the future, and that's Marvel's Wolverine by Insomniac. And I'm extremely excited for this game, not only because it's Insomniac, but behind Spider-Man, Wolverine is my second favourite character in all of fiction. So you can imagine how mental I went when I saw the reveal trailer, and the second I saw the shot of his back, I instantly knew it was going to be a Wolverine game. Now obviously we're going to have to wait a while for the game to come out, as Marvel Spider-Man 2 is still yet to release, and the game is still in early stages of development, and obviously because Wolverine is a completely different character to Spider-Man, there's so much that needs to be made from scratch in terms of gameplay mechanics, levels, and making sure the game's narrative is a strong, mature story for the character. Even if the game suffers any delays, I am perfectly fine with being patient and waiting on Insomniac to release the game when it is ready. But in the meantime, because it's probably going to be a while before we actually see any gameplay of Marvel's Wolverine, I thought it would be a good idea to look back at some older action video games and see what could potentially inspire the developers at Insomniac when it comes to making a Wolverine game. When it came to Insomniac making the first Marvel Spider-Man game, they were actually in quite a fortunate position. There had been multiple 3D open-world Spider-Man games that had come out at that point, and even some 3D linear games that they also took inspiration from. In fact, even the creative director of the original Marvel Spider-Man, Brian Intihar, he stated on a live stream that the three older Spider-Man games that they took inspiration from for making that game was Neversoft Spider-Man, the console version of the Spider-Man 2 movie game, and Beanox's Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions. However, when it comes to Brian Horton and his team working on Marvel's Wolverine, they're not really in the same fortunate position. They're quite limited on the amount of 3D Wolverine games they can look at for inspiration. Not counting any ensemble or team-based Marvel games, looking at strictly solo Wolverine games, they're limited to really only two, which are the console versions of X-Men 2 Wolverine's Revenge and the uncaged edition of the X-Men Origins Wolverine video game. So because of this limited number of 3D Wolverine games, I'd actually be fine if Insomniac wanted to look at other action-adventure hack-and-slash games that are not tied to the Marvel license. And I say action-adventure hack-and-slash games because I'm kind of not really expecting Insomniac's Wolverine game to be an open-world game. When I think of Wolverine, driving around on a motorcycle isn't the first thing that comes to mind when you want to talk about nailing that power fantasy of being Wolverine. It makes sense that the open world genre would be the first thing you think of when it comes to a character like Spider-Man, because you want to nail that feeling of being able to swing through New York, as it's typically the first thing you tend to think of when it comes to Spider-Man. And I just think to a degree that sort of mindset needs to be dialed back a little bit when it comes to thinking of how to make a Wolverine game work. You've got to be open for this character being explored in a different genre that isn't necessarily open world. So for this video, I'm going to do a deep dive on those two Wolverine games that I mentioned, along with a third action-adventure hack-and-slash game that I'm sure any Metal Gear fans out there will know what I'm talking about when I say that Insomniac could potentially take inspiration from this game. I'm going to talk about particular things that I like about each of these games, and to a degree point out some things that I hope Insomniac does not borrow from these games. So I'm going to start off with talking about the oldest 3D Wolverine game, X-Men 2 Wolverine's Revenge. Now look, I know this game might be a little bit controversial now because it's not rated M for mature or a completely bloody violent game, but I don't think that necessarily means that Insomniac should completely write off Wolverine's Revenge. As I said in my last video, I do have a soft spot for this game. I love a lot of the unlockable costumes and the Cerebro files, all the character bios and unlockable extra blooper movies. It was very reminiscent of Neversoft's original PS1 Spider-Man game, who funnily enough actually makes a cameo in this game. I actually quite like the game's music score. I think the graphics have aged well for a game that's nearly 2 decades old at this point. The voice acting is solid, and even though it was weirdly marketed as a movie tie-in game with Hugh Jackman's likeness on the box art, Mark Hamill is pretty good as Wolverine in this game. In fact, one of the biggest strengths of this game is the fact that its story has nothing to do with the Fox X-Men films. In fact, the first opening hour of the game is literally dedicated to telling the game's own version of Wolverine Weapon X. It's a very effective opening that showcases the adamantium bonding process and Wolverine's rampage throughout the facility. One of the things I think I love the most about this game's story is the fact that it was able to revisit the Weapon X origin while also being able to add something new to it. Once the Weapon X flashback is done, we understand that Wolverine is suffering from a deadly virus that all members of the Weapon X program were infected with as a failsafe. It's a very interesting addition to the Weapon X canon, whilst also serving as a compelling plot point that motivates Wolverine to do what he does in the game, basically making it a race against time story for Logan that's filled with themes of revenge. And it's a plot point that also factors into why I like the depiction of Sabretooth in this game. In many of the older Activision Marvel games that feature Wolverine fighting Sabretooth, I always find their rivalry quite one note and dull. However, in the case of this game, I don't feel that way about Sabretooth. Because he was also a member of the Weapon X program, he's also suffering from the same deadly virus that Wolverine is. So both characters are essentially competing over the same goal, which is to find a cure for the Shiva virus, which in a way elevates that rivalry in the context of this game. Now, we have no idea if Insomniac will retell the events of Weapon X in their game at some point, as it's arguably been done quite a number of different ways over the years since this game, so it begs the question, do we even need to see it again? And I would be open to seeing Insomniac's own interpretation of Weapon X, but only if they can figure out a way to add some new interesting lore there, kind of like what Wolverine's Revenge did. But I've talked enough about Wolverine's Revenge story, and I'm sure a lot of you are wondering, well, how is it to play? Does it actually nail the power fantasy of being Wolverine? And the answer to that is, it's complicated. I really do like a lot of the combat and stealth strike animations in this game, as there's a multitude of them, and they even have aged surprisingly well over the years. And even with the T for teen rating for the game, the developers have some animations in this game that, in my opinion, do indeed push the limits of that T for teen rating. I can say I definitely enjoyed playing the game stealthily when I was able to get it to work, and that kind of leads me on to the biggest problems with Wolverine's Revenge. The experience I had playing this game was very similar to how I experienced playing Star Wars Bounty Hunter, in that it starts off very promising with an interesting story and you're enjoying the gameplay for what it is, but then you get to a point where it starts to become incredibly brutal and frustrating, so much to the point that it is very easy to rage quit this game and just not come back to it. There are many combat encounters that throw an unfair amount of enemies at the player. There are stealth levels that, if you even get spotted once, means instant mission failure, and the game also likes to throw some weird instant death traps at the player. Now, to be clear, I would not mind if Insomniac were to up the difficulty curve from Marvel Spider-Man to Wolverine if it is going to be rated PEGI 18 or M for mature, so long as it's not as brutal as it is in Wolverine's Revenge. There's nothing more frustrating in Wolverine's Revenge than going through a level stealthily. You're doing all these really cool combat animations and stealth strikes. You take quite a bit of damage, but you manage to heal up after 5 minutes because the healing factor is so slow in this game. And just then, right as you think you're about to beat the level, after playing for 15 or 20 minutes, you die right at the very end and have to restart the entire level from the beginning. You admittedly can get used to the combat and stealth system, but it's a very steep learning curve in Wolverine's Revenge. I will say, I do like the fact that the game does highlight Wolverine's feral sense and animal instincts. It does manage to put them to good use on occasion. And I do like the fact that Wolverine's Revenge does let you use Wolverine's claws to do minor things like cutting through fences, destroying generators, cutting through certain walls and doorways. It's admittedly not much, but it does give the player the slight illusion that they can cut through anything as Wolverine with his adamantium claws. I'm going to briefly return to talking about the story of Wolverine's Revenge, because I want to talk about one villain that I think they did really well, and another villain that I think they didn't do very well. I actually really like this game's depiction of Wendigo. As a kid, this was my first introduction to Wendigo, and the way they did it was honestly quite creepy and effective. The game briefly plays up Wendigo as a monster in a horror film. You don't outright see Wendigo straight away. The game takes its time and makes you hear brief rumblings in the mine shafts, and you only get to see brief glimpses of Wendigo before he actually does appear, and the boss fight with him is certainly fun and memorable. I can only hope that if Insomniac were to include a villain like Wendigo in their Wolverine game, I hope they play up the horror aspects even more in their game, and that's provided they even have a good reason for including Wendigo. I wouldn't want him to be featured if there's actually no reason for him to be there, which kind of segues into my point about the villain in Wolverine's Revenge that I think they didn't do very well, and that's Omega Red. I mentioned in my last video that there are plot points in Wolverine's Revenge that ultimately go nowhere, and I was more specifically referring to Omega Red. To me, Red's inclusion in Wolverine's Revenge is probably the biggest example of a video game narrative not adhering to the narrative convention of Chekhov's gun. And for those that are unfamiliar with that convention, Chekhov's gun is essentially where if you're writing a story and you put a lot of emphasis on a particular character or a prop or anything that might have some significance to the narrative, you've got to make sure it has a satisfying payoff come the story's conclusion. It's to ensure that nothing you include in a story goes to waste. And when it comes to Omega Red, the context to his appearance is that at a point in the game, Sabretooth breaks him out of this maximum security prison along with Juggernaut and Magneto. Now, the way he is introduced, it sets him up and gives the player the false expectation that you will have a boss fight with him at some point, as you do with Juggernaut and Magneto. However, once you defeat Juggernaut and Magneto and then proceed to the final boss that is Lady Deathstrike, the game ends and you never see Omega Red after his initial debut in that cutscene. In fact, the last scene of the game even makes a joke out of the fact that Wolverine kind of just forgot that he never got to apprehend Omega Red, so it comes across as very unsatisfying. It's like, imagine if Insomniac had done the Raft prison breakout in Marvel Spider-Man, all the Sinister Six is unleashed, and you apprehend 5 of them, and come the end of the game, Peter suddenly remembers, oh yeah, I kind of forgot about Scorpion. It just makes you go, well, what was the point of including that character if you weren't going to do anything with them? We can only assume that the developers of Wolverine's Revenge probably ran out of time to properly design a boss fight for Omega Red, as his character model is in the game, it's just there's no boss fight created around it. So hopefully, if Insomniac does decide to include Omega Red in their game, they will have much more plausible reasoning for him being there and actually have a really cool boss fight in mind for him. I really don't mean to sound very negative when it comes to talking about Wolverine's Revenge, because I ultimately do like the game. I understand there are a lot of problems that hold it back, but at the same time that's also why I think that Insomniac could take inspiration from it. If anything, it can serve as a blueprint for Insomniac for what to do and what not to do when it comes to designing a Wolverine game. And to be honest, a lot of the problems with Wolverine's Revenge, Insomniac will probably be able to fix with ease. Like, for example, mission checkpoints. One of the most annoying ones in Wolverine's Revenge was the boss fight with Juggernaut. If you lose to him, you not only have to start the boss fight from the beginning, but you also have to do the few minutes in the level leading up to him, which made restarting that level very painful to play through, to the point that me and my brother just had to use cheats when we were kids. Before I move on to my final thoughts on Wolverine's Revenge, I'm going to quickly go over one positive and one negative relating to the game. I do like the fact that the game allows you to manually pop and retract the claws. It may seem very minor, but that's a feature that a lot of Wolverine fans will want because it slightly adds to the immersion of the game. It's like when you play Star Wars Battlefront 2 and you play as a Jedi, you can manually switch on and off your lightsaber. And going even further with Wolverine's Revenge, the game gives you the option to fight enemies with your bare fists. You don't always have to use the claws to take them down. However, there are problems with this fighting style. In some cases, when you're fighting regular enemies, it feels like using your bare fists is more effective than actually using the claws to defeat enemies. And also, because the healing factor is tied to your claws being retracted, and this game loves to just spike in terms of difficulty, it means you'll find yourself facing off against certain boss fights like Magneto, and not even bothering to use your claws because of the healing advantage, which seems a bit counterintuitive for a Wolverine game, where the whole appeal should be about using your claws to defeat enemies, and instead this game encourages you not to do that at times. So with all that in mind, I really do hope that Insomniac will take inspiration from Wolverine's Revenge, both good and bad, so they can improve on that game's shortcomings, as well as excel at the things that it did get right, like the amount of unlockable costumes, the combat and stealth strike animations, and telling a story that adds a new layer to Wolverine's backstory. Now on to the next game, which I'm sure a lot of you Marvel fans out there love this game as much as I do. The Uncaged edition of X-Men Origins Wolverine has the best gameplay in a Wolverine game to date. It's so fun for the fact that you can just completely go to town on your enemies and make absolute mincemeat out of all of them. It was a very fun, violent hack and slash game with light and heavy attacks, cool upgradable special abilities, some really gruesome environmental kills, and not to mention my favourite way of killing enemies, the lunge attack. That move in particular was so fun to use when it came to killing annoying enemies from afar that kept shooting at you, to even making many of the game's set pieces quite fun and memorable to play through, like that bit where you have to jump between riverboats, or that bit where you're jumping between cars while you're trying to escape the Weapon X facility. It's the sort of gameplay mechanic that I hope Insomniac resurrects in their game, and if there is indeed going to be some form of motorbike gameplay, I could see it really working well in a set piece where you're driving through the streets of Madripoor and you have to jump between motorbikes, killing enemies. That would just be really cool. Plus, you can't talk about the Uncaged edition of X-Men Origins Wolverine and not bring up that epic multi-part boss fight with a gigantic Sentinel. Also, one of the game's most incredible mechanics is how Wolverine's healing factor works. As you take damage and see his character model get bloodied up, you can also see his adamantium skeleton and watch his skin grow back over it as you heal, which is much more fun than what Wolverine's Revenge did, which was make you stand around for 5 minutes and not have much to look at. Now, while I do indeed love Origins Wolverine, there are some shortcomings that I think hold it back a little bit, in my opinion. I do love the few unlockable costumes you can acquire in this game. I just wish there was more of them. I would have even taken one of Hugh Jackman's black leather outfits from the first 3 X-Men films, which is a bit ironic when you consider that Wolverine's Revenge isn't a movie tie-in game, but it has the X2 suit, and this game is a movie tie-in, but it doesn't have that suit. And while I love the gameplay, the story is a bit messy and really not the reason why people remember this game. The game's story is a lot of flashbacks on top of flashbacks, and because it's also tied to one of the weakest entries in the Fox X-Men films, means you still have to put up with some dumb moments from the film, like fighting that version of Wade Wilson that resembles more or less Baraka from Mortal Kombat than the actual Merc with a Mouth Deadpool, complete with Cyclops eye laser spam. And the connections to that film are ultimately a real shame to me, because the game is honestly at its best narratively when Raven Software is allowed to do their own thing with these very violent blockbuster action set pieces, and throwing in their own boss fights that pull directly from the X-Men comics, like that big Sentinel boss fight. The last negative I have with this game is admittedly very minor, but I think it's worth talking about. It's related to the way that Wolverine's healing factor works in this game. In terms of gameplay, I do love it and think it's way better than how Wolverine's Revenge implemented it, but I do think there is a bit of a disconnect between how it's shown narratively in the cutscenes versus how it actually works in the gameplay. And there is actual video game terminology for this type of occurrence. It's called ludonarrative dissonance, where basically parts of a game's narrative told through cutscenes versus gameplay don't entirely sync up together. I do think the way that Wolverine takes down that Sentinel at the end of that boss fight is incredibly badass, showing he can survive a fall back down to Earth while also taking a Sentinel out on the way down. That's really cool. But when you get to the gameplay and Wolverine can eventually be killed by bullets or falling off a really high building, it just makes you think, really? You can survive a fall back down to Earth, but you can't survive falling off a ledge? I do understand it. They need to create some form of fail state because you can't just be able to breeze through the game completely. There has to be some form of challenge. Which brings me on to one of my biggest questions in terms of how Insomniac will do Wolverine is how will the healing factor be balanced with the gameplay and difficulty? We've seen in the films and the comics that he can survive some absolutely ridiculous feats, like that one point in the comics during the Civil War storyline where Nitro just blew himself up and completely burned off all of Wolverine's skin, only for Logan to then heal back very quickly and just shrug it off like it was nothing. Will Insomniac nerf the healing factor through some sort of narrative excuse? Which I personally would be fine with, but alternatively I can also see Insomniac just outright getting away with it by just specifying that his healing factor isn't as fast or as powerful as other interpretations have been, just because it's how it works in Insomniac's universe. So I've pretty much talked about all the positives and negatives in regards to X-Men Origins Wolverine, but I do want to end it on a bit more positive note, and it's that genuinely Raven Software is one of my favourite developers of all time. They made so many of my favourite games from my childhood, like Star Wars Jedi Academy, which is my favourite Star Wars game, X-Men Legends 1 and 2 and the first Marvel Ultimate Alliance game, and of course this game. And out of all the games I'm talking about in this video, this is probably going to be the one that inspires Insomniac the most in terms of Wolverine games. They've also got the benefit of the fact that some of the shortcomings this game had, Insomniac just naturally won't have because there's no movie to tie into. They'll have the freedom to tell their own story with the character. And I literally cannot wait to play the game and figure out what kind of history this version of Wolverine has been through. One of my favourite things about Insomniac's 2018 Spider-Man game was that beginning phase of discovering the backpacks and trying to figure out, okay, well, which villain has he fought, which has he not fought, what potential storylines have happened and what is yet to occur. They have the potential to make that far more interesting when it comes to Wolverine because they can choose what parts of his backstory they want to keep a mystery. The most obvious thing we can gather from that reveal trailer is that Weapon X has already happened, but we don't even know if Wolverine has even met the X-Men yet, or if he even remembers World War II, maybe fighting alongside Captain America. Has he even gone through the events of Fatal Attractions where Magneto ripped the adamantium out of his skeleton? Because if not, that means the potential is there for Insomniac to do that iconic moment themselves one day. In their own way, of course. I wouldn't want them to just completely rip it off from the comics one-to-one. Now, I know a lot of people consider X-Men Origins Wolverine the blueprint as to what Insomniac should try to do for their own Wolverine game, and I do think that as well. The power fantasy of being able to use Wolverine's claws to tear through enemies limb from limb just hasn't been topped yet in this franchise. However, looking outside of these two Wolverine games that I've covered in great detail, this next game I'm about to talk about is the one that I hope Insomniac takes a considerable amount of inspiration from, which is Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. Simply put, if we were to replace Raiden's sword with Wolverine's adamantium claws and even swap out his Jack the Ripper mode for Wolverine's Berserker Rage, we'd basically have the best Wolverine game never made. For those that are unfamiliar with this game, Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance is a spin-off of the Metal Gear franchise that focuses more on hack and slash action than the tactical stealth espionage gameplay that the series is known for. There is still stealth in the game, but it's not a primary focus of Rising. It's all about slicing and dicing your enemies with the skills of a cyborg ninja, along to an incredible soundtrack by Jamie Christopherson that still slaps to this day. Now, I'm not expecting Insomniac to take any form of narrative inspiration from this game. I'm instead going to focus on the gameplay because there is one in particular mechanic that the developer Platinum Games put into Rising that I think would feel right at home in a Wolverine game. Because what separates Rising from other hack and slash games is its unique selling point, Blade Mode. When the player activates Blade Mode, Raiden can slow down time and the player can rotate the aiming reticle to angle Raiden's attack so he can slash through any enemy and just absolutely cut them to pieces. If you successfully manage to cut through an enemy at a certain angle, you can also perform a special attack and replenish your health and special meter. But here's what's really cool about Blade Mode, is that it's not just limited to enemies, you can also use Blade Mode to cut through multiple objects in the environment and watch how they just crumble to pieces. It's a very satisfying mechanic to use that is also quite skill based. It's extremely well integrated into boss fights. Some of them you will not be able to beat until you have a firm grasp on how Blade Mode works. Playing through the boss fight against Sundowner where you have to cut off parts of his shield, it just made me think, wow, this would be really incredible in a Wolverine game, say where you have to fight against Omega Red and you have to use a form of Blade Mode like mechanic where you have to cut through parts of his tentacles with your claws. That would just be awesome to control. And it's also part of the reason why I think people underestimate how good a solo Wolverine game could be, because it would just be fun to be able to cut through anything with your adamantium claws. Now, as much as I want Insomniac to feature a mechanic like Blade Mode in their Wolverine game, I understand why they might not, because it is a bit over the top if they are trying to tell a mature story, but at the same time I would like to see them try, because there's an opportunity for them to do it better, and plus it wouldn't work the exact same way it does in Metal Gear Rising. You would need to be able to adapt it and overcome certain challenges so that it could fit Wolverine. For instance, whenever Raiden enters Blade Mode, he uses his sword with both both hands. In the case of Wolverine, he'd essentially be dual wielding. Plus, Raiden cuts through enemies and objects with a singular blade. In the case of Wolverine, he'd be using 6 small ones. And it just makes me wonder, if they were to do this, would the gameplay programmers and animators be able to account for the gaps between Wolverine's claws? Because realistically, if you were to cut someone's arm off with Wolverine's claws, you're not just cutting off an arm, you'd be cutting off 2 chunky bits of flesh and bone in addition to the arm. Plus, it's a mechanic you also have to consider balancing in terms of level design. While it would be fun to let players go nuts and absolutely destroy everything in a level, you don't want them to go crazy and accidentally destroy something vital to level progression. Metal Gear Rising was able to find that middle ground of where you could cut through a majority of the objects, but there were obviously certain things you couldn't cut through. But even then, it was able to maintain that illusion of you can cut through anything with a sword, even though you really couldn't. So that's enough talking about blade mode. Now you're probably wondering, well, besides that, what else is there in Metal Gear Rising that could inspire Insomniac? And the answer to that is the customization. Now I have no doubt that Insomniac will deliver when it comes to the amount of unlockable suits for Marvel's Wolverine. We've seen in their previous Spider-Man games that they've gone above and beyond when it comes to delivering unlockable suits. And Logan does have an extensive amount of costumes they could put into the game. And while Metal Gear Rising doesn't have that many unlockable suits, there is an additional layer to the customization that I hope Insomniac can implement into Wolverine. Not only can you change Raiden's appearance, but you can also mix and match the type of sword he has in addition to his outfit. And in the case of Wolverine, we know he hasn't always had adamantium claws, and regardless of whether or not Wolverine's bone claws will serve a narrative purpose in the game's story, it would be cool to have it feature as a bonus cosmetic option when it comes to selecting suits. It would be cool to have maybe the X-Force suit, and then get given the option of instead using adamantium claws, you can equip Wolverine with the bone claws. Not only would it be a good addition in terms of cosmetics, but it would also be great in terms of the photo mode opportunities. I'm sure a lot of Wolverine fans would get a kick out of being able to mix and match different types of suits and claws for different photos. It would just be cool to see those unique combinations that we've not seen in the comics, films or animated shows. And there we have it. I've done my full deep dive on all 3 of these games that I hope will inspire Insomniac. If you've managed to watch all the way through to the end of this video, I really do appreciate you sticking around, because I know it's taken a long time to get this video out, but that's only because I really wanted to make sure I got across everything I wanted to say when it comes to Marvel's Wolverine, because I love the character almost as much as I do Spider-Man. If I could make one recommendation to the fans looking forward to this game, but you don't really have a lot of knowledge on Wolverine as a character, then I highly recommend checking out Wolverine, Creating Marvel's Legendary Mutant, which is an extensive art book that gives you 40 years worth of material and knowledge on the character. It features a lot of iconic artwork to have come from Wolverine over the years, and even features many interviews from comic book creators that have helped shape and develop the character over the years. It's incredibly well researched by Mike Avila, and features incredible cover art by Gabriel Dell'Otto, who is one of my favourite comic book artists of all time. I'll leave US and UK Amazon links down below in the description box. But thank you very much for watching, like the video and subscribe to my channel if you want to, and let me know your level of excitement for Marvel's Wolverine and what features you hope will be included in the game. Once again, my name is Francis, and I'll hopefully hear from you all soon.